I don't know really where it came from other than, man, these eclipse energies are intense. Definitely dealing with the waves of grief that are coming through. In part, I think a lot of it is because there is a great deal of me that feels safe enough to let it out because I held it in for so long. But definitely feeling kind of the release and the relief of it, as bittersweet as that is. But as I've been going through and processing this grief within my own life, and I know that others are out there too, that's part of why it's so powerful, is because it's a shared, there's a lot of us going through this together. But this morning I wanted to talk about forgiveness, and the struggle with forgiveness. First, for the people around me, in the relationships that I was used to and the dynamics, apologies were weaponized, sorries were owed, and they were a control tactic. Shame and guilt were weaponized and used against us. And, even the person that was the primary person for that, that's something that was done to them in their life too. It's a pattern they learned. So this is a pattern of behavior, this shaming pattern of behavior that was acceptable. And as many of you who have grown up in similar homes know, some of us are a little bit more sensitive to that than others. And so we stick out like a sore thumb in those family dynamics because, unlike everybody else who has a thick skin and can kind of just take it, brush it off, and keep walking, and I think a lot of it is just because they're not saying anything. I think there's a great deal of my family that lives in denial of the pain that they are carrying too. I think a lot of us are. But I always struggled because of this with forgiveness, because forgiveness feels like permission. Forgiveness feels like giving my power away to somebody and saying, okay, I'm gonna open myself up to you doing this again. But that is because of who I was around and who I was choosing to allow in my life. And I get to not make that choice anymore, at least moving forward, But I struggled with forgiveness on the outside because it felt like permission. So I adjusted a little bit there so that I could, because it's an important, we need to get there. That is where the release is. But forgiving others for me, in an external expression for others, became more about how I adjusted my behavior. And that was, I don't keep score anymore. Like we all know, I don't need to keep bringing anything up. I don't need to demand an apology myself. I don't even want any of the validation of what happened. I don't need any of that anymore. But I have chosen in action to name it because that helps me. And that helps the accountability, right? So just naming the wound and saying, hey, this hurt me. That's the big thing that I focus on with others. And I don't need to browbeat it over anybody. I just do a quick, wow, that affected me this way. And again, that's mostly for me. I don't even need to tell them. But I do name what happened. That prevents me from denying it. But within myself, I think one of the things that I notice and have noticed is, because of that conditioning growing up, I retreat immediately to self-shaming. So much so that forgiveness inside for me, for myself, is difficult because that shaming has been an identity. That I was scapegoated. That was who I became, was the family shame. So that was an identity. So forgiveness is hard for me within myself because if I forgive myself, then I have to let go of that identity of shame that I built, that identity of guilt. and those behaviors with it, because forgiving myself is also making a commitment to change those perspectives about myself. And that is very, very challenging. The ego doesn't want to let go of even familiar suffering and comfortable behavior patterns. Right? And I think a lot of that is kind of where I'm sitting. It's not even that any of the pain is new or any of the grief is new. And I think a lot of you are probably feeling similarly. Like, you may have had one small trigger, but it's bringing up a lifetime of stuff because you're sitting in a similar spot where you're looking at yourself and going, wow, did a great job of turning this into a thing. I didn't just have shame, I became shame, right? Kind of like, I view angels and demons just as like the purity of principle. They are a principle, a value to its extreme in either the way we view it as good and supportive or negative and detrimental, right? So I became shame within my own head, right? That was my demon. So I have to name that too and be out loud with it about myself. And I have to be willing to go to war with it when it comes up. And that to me is forgiveness. Because I always rankled when people tried to tell me that I had a self-love problem. Because if I really had a self-love problem, why would I be fighting so hard for others to love me? The reason I'm fighting for others to love me is because something inside me knows I'm loved and lovable and all of those things. I think that's the same for you too, if you really look. I don't think that we have a love problem. I think that we have other masks over the top of it, and we're not naming it correctly for ourselves, right? Like, words really aren't good containers for these things. So we do the best that we can in telling the stories to ourselves in a way that makes sense. But I'd really challenge you, just because of the way it is helping me get through, because this eclipse is bringing up a lot of purging energies. And we can see it also reflected in the world around us with the things that are crumbling, the structures that are falling there too. Name it. Name it true. What is it truly, right? What is the value or the principle that is hurting? And then what does that mean you need to be, right? Because if I am becoming shame within my psyche, right? That means all of my thoughts are geared towards my own destruction. Then to go to war with that within myself, I have to become the opposite, which again is love. It's love. So anytime I have a thought that comes through that is based on those shame patterns and those stories and those narratives that were drilled into my brain, I have to be aware enough and willing to battle it. That is forgiveness to me. Being willing to change the story and being willing to do the work to view myself a different way. And I know that I can do that because self-love wasn't ever the problem. Anyway, that's what I've got. Just wanted to share that because we experience things as a collective. And I know that I am not the only one out there who is just being hit out of left field with this grief and these reviews, right? Several of my tarot readings have been coming up. So I know you're out there, because not all of them have been telling just my story, right? But the review part, we are in a state of review. That is where our discernment is coming up. And that review is being able to name our values correctly for ourselves, to name our principles, to define our meaning for ourselves. And we are reviewing how we have been doing that. And this is an opportunity to notice those patterns and where we have been limiting ourselves, right? So like for me, where have I been limiting myself in my shame perspectives, right? Where have I been self-sabotaging in that way? And so that's kind of where we're going with this. And if you're out there and you are going through it, I am with you. If you want to share your story in the comments, feel free. I'd love to interact with you, and I will. but I'd love to interact with you, and even just to be able to say you're not going through it alone. I see you, and we're getting through it, okay? But just some things that I do. Anyway, I hope they help you. Thanks.